Some notes about the birds as you go into watching it. This is, of course, our last film for the quarter. A few things about the origin of the story and the film production. The film was based on a Daphne du Maurier short story. Du Maurier, if you remember, also wrote the original material for Hitchcock's film Rebecca. And she also wrote a novel called Jamaica Inn, which Hitchcock turned into a film. This film is very loosely based on du Maurier's story. The film has a different ending than du Maurier gives, and there's also no central character in the story called Melanie, who is the main character in the film. You can see her on the bottom left-hand side there, played by Tippi Hedren. The film, in addition to being loosely based on this short story, it was actually more directly inspired by a couple of news stories. And the first news story was one that Hitchcock read in April of 1960. There was this incident in the Southern California town of La Jolla where 1,000 birds flew down a chimney and ravaged the inside of a house. And when Hitchcock read about this news incident in the news, it reminded him of du Maurier's story. And so the kind of the seed of the film I was planted there, but he didn't do anything about the story at the time. Then a year later in 1961, there was another news report about a different incident with birds. And the headline of this news report was "A Seabird Invasion Hits Coastal Homes." And this was a story from the seaside California town of Santa Cruz. And this news story describes thousands of migrating gulls who had flown into the town of Santa Cruz about 3 a.m. in the morning, smashed into cars and buildings. They broke street lamps. They tried to enter homes. And the birds were also drawn to the flashlights of people who had gone out to investigate. Now, Hitchcock even more strongly reacted to this story, and so it really prompted him to go ahead and make a film. And he actually was even mentioned in the printed version of this Santa Cruz story because he called the paper and asked for the news report. And then when they printed up their final version, they mentioned that the famous director Alfred Hitchcock had called and was interested in the story. So some interesting overlap there. Some interesting things to note about the production of the film and the birds themselves. So, for the film, they used this mix of live birds, both trained and untrained birds, and they also used mechanical birds and bird puppets and images of birds. So it's a really huge mix. They actually hired to a man named Ray Berwick, who was an animal trainer, for help in getting birds for the film and for keeping them on set as well. I'm just reading a little bit from Camille Paglia's great little book on the birds, where she talks about Berwick here. She says, to do the animal work, Hitchcock hired Ray Berwick, who also worked on the film Birdman of Alcatraz. The birds were difficult to obtain, however, and Berwick went on night missions to crow rookeries, sneaking in to throw nets over the settled crows. Berwick needed 8 months for preparations and on-set training of the birds, who lived in 40 studio pens and consumed 100 pounds of birdseed and 200 pounds of shrimp, anchovies, and meat per day. After shooting had finished, most birds were released back into the wild. However, 50 crows refused to leave the studio lot and perched near Hitchcock's bungalow. They soiled his car until the tree they were roosting in was cut down. So, a bit of real life revenge, maybe, of birds on Hitchcock, which I'm sure Hitchcock appreciated. Another bit of fun, quote unquote, fun trivia. The film crew got parasitic lice at one point from the birds, so they were definitely working up close and personal with the birds. In terms of the how Hitchcock used the birds in the film, just pay specific attention to all the scenes where they're used. But the final shot in particular, Hitchcock said it was one of the hardest he ever did, in part because it has real birds in it, but it's this beautiful multi-layered composite of live action and matte paintings. So it's just really a gorgeous shot, but also to look at in terms of looking at it, but technically extremely difficult as well. A few comments about expectations about The Birds. The Birds is a film that just to give you a bit of personal reaction, when I first saw it many years ago, I felt kind of let down by it. But it is a film now that has truly grown on me, and it is really one of my, I don't know, maybe my top 5 Hitchcocks, although it's hard to choose because I love them all so much. But Robin Wood himself had a similar experience, and I think that's helpful for us to hear going into the film. He says, "My own experience with the birds has been varied and disconcerting. At first, it seemed to me a great disappointment. Now, after repeated viewings, it seems to me among Hitchcock's finest achievements." He further said that he felt coming around to the film has been a matter of breaking down a number of preconceptions, so that only at the fifth or sixth viewing did I feel that I was really seeing the film, instead of being frustrated because it wasn't what I had assumed it was going to be and ought to have been. Only then, on the fifth or sixth viewing and kind of taking the film on its own terms, did it begin to make complete instead of merely fragmentary and intermittent sense. Robin Wood notes that especially if viewers have just watched Psycho, as indeed we have, you might have certain expectations which will fail. So one expectation that would be kind of developed by Psycho is will be relative to the mother-son relationship that's in the film The Birds. There is one in this film, and when we see it, we might expect it to be something similar to Psycho, which is of course problematic in terms of the relationship itself. So kind of be aware of that expectation. That is not, you shouldn't like make a direct tie to that, even though we've been over the course of the quarter linking films and seeing similar themes and motifs. Another expectation that you might have will be relative to the main character, Melanie, in this film. We might expect, based on our experience with Psycho, to identify and sympathize with Melanie like we identify with Marion, and sympathize with her. But Hitchcock is going for something much different here with Melanie's character. So try not to compare the experiences and try not to kind of judge Melanie in the way that you would judge Marion, but think instead about what Melanie's function is in this film, why he portrays her in the way she does, why she's not as sympathetic as Marion, why we're not so much immersed in her in that sympathy, and think about why Hitchcock kind of chooses a different tactic here. One other thing to think about with this film in particular is the idea of Hitchcock choosing a sort of aesthetic, ideological, and emotional reality or an emotional effect over a realistic or over realism. It is important to remember that Hitchcock doesn't generally go for what we might call simple realism. He always did want to get certain things right. Like he wanted to get the UN building in North by Northwest right, and he wanted to get the British Museum right in Blackmail. And he wanted those to be exactly right down to the detail and how they looked. So in this film, the town itself, the buildings and the people are very much what the real town of Santa Cruz is like. He wanted the locale to be super specific. But he never really does go for what we might call documentary realism in terms of the overall film and the overall aesthetic, the overall story even. So there's that wonderful crop duster scene in North by Northwest, which is amazing and wonderful and one of the best scenes in film of all time. But it's not documentary realism. So his aim there in North by Northwest and his aim here in The Birds is something else. It's not, he's not going for documentary. So so even in terms of like certain special effects, don't let those kind of put you off and consider the aesthetic and the emotional and the ideological uh, motivation behind them rather than feeling that the realism has failed. Because if he's not going for a certain documentary realism and you're judging it on those grounds, then you're not really taking the film for what it's supposed to be. So kind of think about that. I also think it would be fun for you to watch the trailer for the film that Hitchcock created. But one word of warning about the trailer, I think it is a great trailer, and you'll see why. It's very funny in a classically Hitchcock way, but I also think it's a bit misleading as a trailer, perhaps unfortunately so, because it primarily, what the trailer does is it suggests that there's a reason behind the horror that we see in The Birds. And I think the film itself subverts any expected rationales for the horror, and I don't want to give too much away about the film. But just keep that in mind as you watch the trailer and try to keep that trailer separate in some sense from the film itself. Now, because I think it will be a little bit better quality for you if you watch the trailer on your own with the original link. I'm not going to play it right here for the video, but I'm putting the trailer right below this introductory video on the Canvas page, so you can check it out there. So enjoy the trailer. Keep in mind that the trailer is a little bit fleeting for what this film exactly is. Um, but after you watch the trailer, then enjoy the film. And I'm really looking forward to talking with you all about this as our last film of the Hitchcock class.